Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 183, September 16th to September 22nd, 1864. Last week, we talked about Abraham Lincoln's re-election bid for the year 1864. His victory would pretty much seal the fate of the Confederacy. We also started to set up what we will talk about this week, the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864. To do that, we will head to some familiar territory as we start in Winchester, Virginia. Before we go to Winchester, though, let's talk a little bit about our Patreon and Patreon content. And as some of you might know, we have posted an episode a little bit different this month, and that is going to be some poetry, or we read some poems that were written by individuals who either served in the war or were living at the time of the war, and the subject matter is, of course, the Civil War. So there is some pretty interesting imagery to take away from those. We talk about a couple of them, both from the north and the southern perspective as well. And if that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and we also post movie reviews, memoir reviews, picture slideshows of the present day battlefields and sites that you can go and see. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So you're getting an extra episode, as it were, every month for even the low price of $1. So if that sounds like it would interest you, there is, once again, a link in the show description. It's greatly appreciated. So, as we briefly mentioned, Phil Sheridan is going to take charge of the region on August 7th. Most recently, we had an engagement that cripples the Confederate cavalry arm, Averell mounting a surprise attack at Moorefield, West Virginia. Remember, too, that the cavalry had burned Chambersburg, raiding into Pennsylvania, as well as Maryland. The Federals had caught them and made them pay for this transgression. Many of the Federal troopers very upset that the northern city had been torched. Keep in mind as well, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about early moving into Maryland and the Battle of Monocacy, that there was more ransoming going on of these towns. There was more of an effort to try to get some sort of monetary supplies, of course, but also a monetary amount that was going to go toward the troops in the Confederacy. Now, also, I believe we mentioned this in our Monocacy episode, but just the fact that you're ransoming off this town, not only are these towns, with the exception of Chambersburg, which is in Pennsylvania, these are Maryland cities that you are trying to extort money from, but that's also seen as particularly disagreeable, with your Victorian ideals and whatnot. It's making you more seem like outlaws, vandals, pirates, right? Not so much a warring nation as the Confederates are going to want to be perceived. So obviously, for multiple reasons, you can understand why the North is upset. You can understand why the South would probably not necessarily look too kindly on these actions. However, by this stage in the war, kind of just throwing anything against the wall and seeing what sticks. With the rebel horsemen at a disadvantage, Sheridan would send cavalry to begin operating in the Loudoun Valley and beyond. Early would spend time setting up his headquarters at Bunker Hill, which was in between Winchester and Martinsburg. A little to the east, Sheridan was setting up near Charlestown. If you look at a map, in the northern part of the Shenandoah Valley, in a relative parallelogram, we have Bunker Hill, with Winchester to the south, Berryville to the east of Winchester, and then north of Berryville was Charlestown. Bunker Hill will be west of Charleston on a straight line. Harper's Ferry would be a little to the east of Charlestown, with Halltown, West Virginia, in between these two locations. The Federals would dig in at Halltown during the early part of the campaign. Front Royal is a little south of Berryville, so hopefully that will be a good description. But once again, I will try to post a map so everyone understands exactly where everything is. Now, having moved into the Loudoun Valley, the Union cavalry would then extend south toward Winchester. Early had given ground in the face of the Federal Army early in the campaign. August 16th would see a skirmish at a place called Guard Hill. Kershaw's command would be accompanied by Wickham's troopers and engage Federal cavalry at this location, which is where the North and South Forks of the Shenandoah River meet. This is going to be very close to the old Front Royal battlefield. Wickham's cavalry would push Devon's brigade as it guarded the river crossings here. Once on the other side of the ford, though, Devon would hit the rebels in the flank, capturing some colors in the process. Infantry would approach a new defensive position that the Union had set up. Wofford's brigade would begin crossing Crooked Run before the position would be set upon by the 5th New York and part of the 6th New York Cavalry. The Confederates would be rescued by Wickham's mounted arm, but not before several hundred were captured. Artillery would start to lob shells from Guard Hill at the Union troops, who, although reinforced by Custer, would withdraw. They had inflicted almost 500 casualties, mostly captured, at the cost of only 71. In many ways, Guard Hill is kind of a precursor to these events that we are going to see unfold in the valley, where the Union cavalry is going to be very much improved, on par and even greater than their Confederate counterparts. We really haven't seen that so far in this region. Kershaw would a few days later set upon the rear guard of the Union Army and even the score, flipping the script from Guard Hill. Now Sheridan was pulling back because of the arrival of the new troops under Anderson. Grant had informed him, estimated that the Confederates now had some 40,000 men. While this is a super high estimation, the addition of key veterans to Early's force would be concerning. On August 21st, the Confederates would skirmish with the Federals again at a place called Summit Point. This would actually be more of a running fight, with the Federals giving ground to Kershaw and Wharton, eventually falling back through Charlestown to Halltown. Sheridan would open the door for Early to get back into Maryland in yet another invasion of the North at this point. The plan was that he could strike and prevent the enemy from retreating, really highlighting how the destruction of the rebel army would be the primary goal for Little Phil, at least in the early stages of the campaign. Early is not going to take the bait, though. Instead, his army had fortified Fisher's Hill previously and then reoccupied Bunker Hill. Anderson's men had dug in near Halltown, but they would be driven out by the 26th due to an attack by Crook. With the recall of Anderson's troops on the table, Sheridan would organize an assault. He would try to flank the rebels and defeat them as they were currently strung out at the top of the Shenandoah Valley. Grant would approve of this plan, meeting with him in September. You see, there had been some positioning in this region, with Sheridan probing the Confederate line, but he had not yet struck at the Confederates. Early was lulled into a false sense of security, and so Anderson's men would be seemingly headed back to Petersburg, where Lee needed them following the continued action around the Weldon Railroad that we talked about a few episodes ago. Sheridan, for his part, would act aggressively since Atlanta had now fallen. It would have been difficult to explain his army getting smashed and Sherman being rebuffed in Georgia. His new tactics would involve the infantry acting with joint operations with the cavalry, something he was very eager to try out. Additionally, Sheridan would utilize scouts disguised as Confederates. You may remember this being utilized in the Grierson raid in Mississippi, and if you are a Patreon member, you heard mention of the Jesse Scouts in John O. Kassler's memoir. Federal-leaning civilians would also give aid to Sheridan by providing him with valuable intelligence. September 3rd and 4th would see skirmishing at Berryville. Sheridan moving out and Anderson moving away as the rebels would run into Crook. Several hundred casualties would result from the 2 days of fighting, Early arriving to rescue Anderson before pulling back across Appoquon Creek. Berryville, in that regard, was sort of unfortunate timing because Anderson was withdrawing his command, and it just kind of runs into the Union Army in a counter battle that we have talked about before, that type of engagement. But another thing that we should highlight here as well is Ulysses S. Grant and his relationship with Phil Sheridan. Now, if you put everything in perspective, and I know we haven't gotten to Franklin and Nashville yet, where George Thomas is going to be the primary commander for the Union Army there is a very big difference in how Grant is going to treat Sherman, treat Sheridan, versus how he's going to treat seemingly an outsider in Thomas. Now, he's very patient with Sheridan, even though he's kind of like, you kind of have to do something, right? But also, there is this weight lifted off the Union Army with the fall of Atlanta. That's another reason why that is such a big deal, because now there is a field victory for the Union Army that's going to go toward the re-election of Abraham Lincoln, and you can be a little bit less cautious, shall we say. Reckless might not be the right word, but you can be a little bit more aggressive than if you had been kind of waiting for this victory and you know that any kind of losses on the record are going to go toward maybe Lincoln getting fired, losing the election. So you don't want to be the reason that happens. We can go all the way back to kind of the fallout of First Manassas, where these generals don't want to be the next one to have a First Manassas happen where they lose, and it's just going to keep reappearing. But when the tactical situation changes, to Sheridan's credit, with a little bit of a poke from Grant, he's going to actually move out and act offensively. As September crept on, more probing was done by Sheridan, with Grant urging him to act. Sheridan was not the first choice to lead this expedition, and it seemed like he was in over his head. Planning to strike the rebels was desperately needed. He would plan a target of Stephen Ramseur's men across Opequon Creek. Once he eliminated this command, he could turn his attention to the rest of Early's army. You see, Early had sent Wharton to Stevenson's Depot. You remember the location of Milroy's thrashing, with Rhodes and Gordon farther north. If Sheridan could isolate Ramseur, who was a little east of Winchester, that would net him a big win, but only if speed could be achieved. Wilson's cavalry and the 6th Corps would lead the way. September 19th marked as the day of the assault. In the morning, cavalry was able to brush away the pickets, gaining the side of the creek fairly easily. Wilson's cavalry would engage with Johnson's infantry. They would throw themselves at the Confederates, who would give ground before turning and firing. I've seen some sources that have pointed to this initial stage of the action as kind of the point where the Confederacy loses the battle. Spoiler alert. And there's a lot of other factors that would have unfolded. There's a lot of tactical situations that would have been very different. But had there been more of an aggressive fight at the creek, and had Wilson's troopers not been able to gain the other side, then that kind of just destroys Sheridan's whole plan. So obviously, there's a lot of what-if scenarios and things that we can point at, and certainly, even in the very opening stage of this battle, we have one. Despite the success of Wilson, the 6th Corps would be delayed. You see, the baggage for the Corps had been ordered by Sheridan to not accompany the infantry, a directive that Horatio Wright had ignored. That same baggage that Horatio Wright had decided to keep was going to be in the way of the 19th Corps and the Army of the Shenandoah. Sheridan would angrily order the wagons to be dumped into ditches so that the remainder of the army could arrive on the field. The delay, though, would be enough for Early to respond to the threat. With Wharton at Leetown to the north of Winchester, Rhodes and Early would arrive to reinforce Ramseur. The original plan of attack for the Union Army called for a strike along the east-west Berryville Turnpike. Wilson would drop down below the pike, protecting that flank, and hopefully, as mentioned, getting into the rear of the Confederates. The northern troopers would engage cavalry under Lunsford Lomax at this point. North of the main battle line, the Union troopers remaining would engage Confederates, reinforced by Wharton's small command, formerly Breckinridge's division. There they would push hard on the rebels, forcing them back, especially armed with Spencer repeaters. One Confederate would write, "The U.S. sharpshooters were sending lead at us very fast. We could hear the lead whizzing over our heads. By this time, we were near the top of the ridge, and several batteries opened on us, and the air was full of flying lead and iron. The shells burst over and behind us, pieces tore up the ground, and the horses plunged in every way, and fast horses left the slower ones, and in less time than it takes to tell it, the regiment was scattered 300 yards wide." It's obviously a very brief account, but it also gives you an idea of just kind of the ferocity in which the Union cavalry and their horse artillery supporting, are going to be coming at the Confederates. In the center of the line, the two sides would start to form up. Ramseur would slide to the south of the Bearville Pike, with Rhodes and Gordon taking the center and left. Wright would form south of the pike with the 19th Corps up on his right. Wright's divisions would only have David Russell in reserve. The Army of West Virginia would be late arriving to the field, but with the early success, the Union troops would rumble forward. Despite being outnumbered, the Confederate artillery was well placed, and combined with small arms fire would prove to be very effective. South of the pike, the stalwart Vermont Brigade would be forced to peel off, the other brigades still advancing. This would leave a gap in the attacking column, which would be exploited by Robert Rhodes. Rhodes would throw Coleman Battle and his Alabama men into the fray, the same Alabamians he had commanded earlier in the war. As he encouraged them, a Federal shell would burst overhead, killing the young general. The fact that he had fallen was hidden from his men, the Federals scrambling to stem the tide. The 114th New York would jump in from Beale's brigade of Dwight's command and be savaged by Virginians. We have an account of their part of the action. The veterans of Stonewall Jackson fired amazingly low, so that the grass and the earth in front of the regiment was cut down and torn up by a perfect sheet of lead. Their bullets sought the hiding places of the men with fatal accuracy, and by ones and twos and threes they went crawling to the rear, with their blue clothes defaced with streaks and lots of crimson gore. Blood was on everything, was everywhere, was spattered upon bushes, was gathered in ghastly puddles upon the ground. David Russell would have his division to stop the oncoming rebels. In the process, Russell too would be hit by a shell fragment and fall as he threw his command into the gap to hold off of Rhodes. Cuvier Grover's command to the north of the pike would advance through trees known as the First Woods, but his men would sustain heavy casualties and be thrown back from getting through the Second Woods. Gordon's command would do good work in this part of the field, despite the Georgia Brigade breaking at one point. This would reportedly be the only time in the war that particular brigade, that of Clement Evans, formerly of Gordon, would run when faced with an enemy. Now, Jubal Early is not going to be a particular fan of Gordon, especially after the war. He's going to be seeing him as a rival. In this particular stage of the combat, Gordon has risen through the ranks, and he is a rising star for the Confederacy. Really, several generals, young generals, and they're not all going to make it out of the campaign, spoiler alert, but Gordon is certainly a very capable subordinate. And for somebody who was not a professional soldier before the war, he's done a really good job of getting to this point. While there's going to be some pretty big bumping of heads later in the campaign, 3rd Winchester is a rare example of where Jubal Early is going to be having a good day in terms of playing nicely with others, of playing in the sandbox with his subordinates. He is going to be able to place artillery in good positions, rally troops when necessary, so he does a good job on the field. And it shows in the repulse of this initial Union assault, but there were going to be more. The batteries that Jubal Early was placing were some of the best in the Army of Northern Virginia, and used canister to great effect to mow down the attacking Federals. In fact, Grover's division would be broken one brigade at a time, the soldiers riding of skedaddling before the defiant rallying rebels. The Confederates were now in a line close to the city of Winchester, but they were in a tough spot, bending back to the pressure, and the Army of West Virginia not having come into the fight just yet. Crook, whose command was called the Buzzards, would jump into the fray. Now, whose idea it was for the attack is up to debate. Crook and Sheridan were both roommates at West Point, and they were going to feud after the war. Sheridan would claim, of course, that it was his idea, while Crook would mention he acted without the approval of his commanding officer. Regardless of who ordered the attack, the Buzzards were able to put pressure through the second woods, but advanced no farther as the Confederates had been able to stabilize their line. Once again, artillery was used to great effect by the Confederates. The Federals who participated in the attack would write about how a stream bank stopped them and broke momentum. Now, Early, by this point, knew his army was reaching the breaking point. He had pulled Wharton's command away from skirmishing with the Federal cavalry to bolster his main line, but Sheridan would roll the dice and try to bring down a general advance. This would include the cavalry, especially to the north of the city, the rebels falling back to an earthwork called Fort Collier. Wesley Merritt and George Armstrong Custer, two of the boy generals, would rumble down the flank, breaking the Confederate left. Patton's brigade, which had stayed to try to stem the Union mounted advance, would break as a result of this mounted charge. Fitzhugh Lee would be swept up in the drive, actually Lee being wounded in the process. Patton would fall as his men moved into the city. Custer would describe the advance. One continuous and heavy fire of skirmishers covered the advance, using only the carbine, while the other line, as they advanced across the open country, the bands playing the national airs, presented in the sunlight one moving mass of glittering sabers. This, combined with the various bright-colored banners and battle flags, intermingled here and there with the plain blue uniforms of the troops, furnished one of the most inspiring as well as imposing scenes of martial grandeur ever witnessed upon the battlefield. Now, obviously, Custer is prone to exaggerating just a tad, so we can also take it with a grain of salt. However, this is a mounted charge, and a charge that probably would not have happened earlier in the war. And certainly, as mentioned, the Union cavalry is going to be better equipped to stand toe-to-toe with their Confederate counterparts, and Sheridan is going to really believe in using them as an offensive force. We talked about how early in the war there is this emphasis that cavalry is going to really only be used to fight cavalry, to scout, to screen, and Sheridan's like, well, why don't we just use these guys as well as the infantry? And it's a tactic that Nathan Bedford Forrest is also lauded for. He kind of uses his men sort of as infantry as well. And that's not to say that these guys are groundbreaking in terms of tactics and strategy, but it is certainly something that works here at 3rd Winchester. Now, with the left collapsing, the rout would turn general, especially with the Federal infantry pressing the front. Early had taken some measures to make sure his army's supplies and artillery would be saved. Stephen Dodson Ramseur's command would also form a good rear guard, protecting the army as it made its way to Fisher's Hill. Sheridan, despite suffering 5,000 casualties, had won a great victory, inflicting some 3,600 on Early's command, including 2,000 or so captured. Stonewall had won at 1st Winchester, Ewell at 2nd Winchester, but for some of the command of the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, a third Battle of Winchester was going to be one too many. Early would withdraw his army to Fisher's Hill, a good defensive position south of Strasburg. The only issue with that is that the earthworks were going to be stretched, as he had lost anywhere from 20 to 30% of his army. Additionally, Early had thought Sheridan would pause, but Little Phil would be hot on his heels. He would hold a council of war as the two armies arrived around Strasburg on September 20th and 21st. The decision would be to attack. Early had deployed Wharton on the right flank, anchored there by the Shenandoah River, with Gordon, Pegram taking over Ramseur's division, and Ramseur taking over Rhodes's old outfit. On the extreme left of the Confederate line, past now Ramseur's division, would be Lunsford Lomax's cavalry. The dismounted cavalry would be the target of the Union assault. Now, weirdly, Jubal Early had put a lot of blame on his mounted arm. While by this point in the war, they were not so well supplied, Early had a mentality that they were still glory seekers. But also, oddly enough, Jubal Early is going to put the cavalry in the only position that the Union Army could really exploit them. So you would say this is just an interesting decision. And you read after the war and even during the war how Early is saying like infantry is better, cavalry is not so good, my cavalry isn't so good out here, and it is a very puzzling decision to have them in the place of honor, shall we say, here at Fisher's Hill. Early, at this point, is also going to be losing an experienced battlefield presence in John Breckinridge, that officer being sent back to Southwest Virginia. Remember, he was present for the first attempt on Saltville. Early had not bumped heads with Breckinridge and realized that the former vice president was actually a fairly capable officer. With the 6th and 19th Corps holding the rebels in place, Crook's buzzards would again be tabbed, with marching up Little North Mountain and then flanking the rebels. This would be true to their other nickname, the Mountain Creepers. On September 22nd, despite Early later claiming he was preparing to withdraw, the Army of West Virginia would come crashing down on the cavalry, scattering the poorly equipped command. Ramseur might have had a beat on the movement of Crook's command, but he did not act, nor did he inform Early, so the assault would come across as a surprise. As Early needed to dispatch Williams Wickham, who had taken over for the wounded Lee to deal with Torbert's raiding into the Luray Valley again, he would have no other reserves. Ramseur would try to shift brigades to meet the threat, but with Crook on the flank and James Ricketts' division pressing from his front, the Confederates would again collapse, followed by Pegram, with Gordon and Wharton withdrawing in relative good order. Brian Grimes would attempt to rally his breaking Tar Heels and actually do a good job of doing so, barely escaping the field, having to cut an artillery horse free and ride off. The remaining artillery was captured, so sudden the assault was. Despite Early getting his train away in time, the Federals had won another astounding victory. Another 1,200 rebels became casualties, again mostly incaptured, at the cost of only 500 of their own number. Gordon would write one word, flanked, in his memoir to describe the action, which was over before it really had begun. While there are not many in killed or wounded, Sandy Pendleton, a former aide of Jackson, depicted in the movie Gods and Generals, we reviewed a while back, was hit in the abdomen and killed when the Confederates tried to establish a rallying position. Fisher's Hill was another not-so-good performance by Early, but he would have help on the way in Kershaw and Rosser's cavalry sent by Lee. By this point, the forces in the valley were quite depleted. One North Carolina regiment was commanded by a lieutenant. Patton's old brigade had started with 2,100 men and was now down to nearly 200. Still, there was an army in the field, and the latter part of September would see his command tracking south, moving to Mount Jackson and then Port Republic. It would be at Port Republic where he would make a stand, especially in the face of Union cavalry. Sheridan, for his part, would become dissatisfied with the level of pursuit by William Wing Averill, and so would relieve him, replaced by Lowell. Now, it had been Torbert who was tasked with cutting off the rebel retreat, so Averill was kind of given the short end of the stick, but in certain cases there has to be a fall guy. Torbert in the meantime would raid, destroying bridges and supplies in Stanton and Waynesboro. The removal of the Confederate Army would allow Sheridan to start what was one of his main goals of the campaign, the general destruction of the Shenandoah Valley, known locally as the Burning. This decision would coincide with his decision to return north to Winchester. Now, Grant was actually wishing for him to turn east to Charlottesville and then on to Richmond and Petersburg from the other side, but this was something that Sheridan was not willing to do. He had moved as far as Harrisonburg, but his supply lines would become very stretched. Partisans continued to harass his men, a good example being the death of John Meigs, who was beset upon by 3 scouts disguised in blue. When it was discovered that they were in fact Confederates, the mounted men fired on Meigs, killing the young officer. which also spurned rumor that he'd been killed while trying to surrender or even executed. We talked a little while back about this during our Patreon episode on the memoirs of John Singleton Mosby. Sheridan would initially wish to burn the town of Dayton, but thought better of it at the request of the 116th Ohio's Colonel Thomas Wilds. As it was by early October, the Federals were moving back toward Winchester, but not until the destruction was complete. A Rockingham County registrar would report 30 dwellings, 450 barns, 100 miles of fencing, 31 mills, 3 factories, 1 furnace, and the slaughter or confiscation of 1,750 cattle, 1,750 horses, 4,200 sheep, 3,350 hogs, and the destruction of 100,000 bushels of wheat, 50,000 bushels of corn, and 6,332 tons of hay. And that is only there in one county, the county around Harrisonburg, Rockingham County. Now, the other thing that we need to point out, too, is that Grant has this kind of vision where Sheridan is going to act in concert with his armies that are currently around Petersburg and Richmond. He's going to be able to cut off any kind of lines of supply back to the Shenandoah Valley and then come in from the western direction of the city, and then he's going to be able to join in the siege. And there's, of course, is going to break the siege, or they're going to carry by assault Richmond and Petersburg. Now, this would have been a pretty interesting concept, and it might have actually prolonged the war a little bit, because if you have Sheridan coming in from that direction and Early kind of shadowing him, it's probably going to force Robert E. Lee to try to evacuate a little bit sooner than he did, and he would have had a much greater force than he would toward the end of the war, right, to deal with the Union armies as they tried to chase and catch him. But it also kind of illustrates how lenient Grant is in his relationship with Phil Sheridan. He wants Sheridan to do this one thing, and Sheridan's just like, well, my lines of supply are too stretched, so I'm going to go back north. And Sheridan does have a point. There is some pretty heavy partisan activity. You know, we've talked about Mosby and his ghosts, and it's going to make moving south in the Shenandoah Valley very difficult. So there hasn't been a Union commander yet who has been able to do that and sustain a presence in the Shenandoah Valley. So Sheridan's going to do the next best thing. He has not quite eliminated Jubal Early's army, but he certainly has inflicted pretty heavy casualties on him. Now he's going to destroy any support that the Shenandoah Valley can supply the Confederate armies in Richmond. Now, Early was not going to be exactly idle during this time. He would dispatch Rosser, elevated to division command for Wickham, to try to harass the Union army. Thomas Rosser and his Laurel Brigade were mostly Valley natives, so there was much fanfare with their return to the region. Sheridan would grow impatient at all the savior of the Valley talk and personally order Rosser to be whipped by his cavalry. This force, combined with Lunsford Lomax, would head for Tom's Brook in early October. The Gray troopers would try to harass their federal counterparts, not stopping the destruction of the valley, but pressuring them, angry at the results. Torbert would turn and face the rebels on October 9th. Lomax, advancing up the Valley Pike, would make contact with Lowell and Devon under Merritt, the Federals driving away the poorly armed Southerners. Some of the Confederate troopers were armed with infield rifles. Not a bad weapon for infantry, but against carbines, pistols, and repeaters, on the part of the Union, they would be at a severe disadvantage. Colonel Kidd, whose memoir we have also reviewed, will be joined by the newly minted division commander, Custer, and assess the position on the hill that Rosser held. Custer would bow before Rosser, his former West Point friend, returning the favor before the battle commenced. Kidd's brigade, formerly Custer's, would flank the rebels out of their position, driving them from the field. The Federals would term the fight the Woodstock Races, suffering only 57 casualties compared to over 300. Another setback for Early would anger Lee's bad old man. If the cavalry could do nothing, then it was going to be up to the infantry. With that, we'll go ahead and pause. This week we fought the Third Battle of Winchester, a big win for Phil Sheridan and the Union. We also fought the Battle of Fisher's Hill, driving home that first victory, and started the destruction of the Shenandoah Valley. Next week, we're actually going to head out to Missouri, a place that we have not been for some time, as well as return to Richmond and fight the Battle of Fort Harrison. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.